Prohibition. Americans were not allowed to drink alcohol, and then they were again. It's a weird little bottle episode in American history. Something we did for a little bit, then abandoned. And it was so long ago and so strange it's almost hard to believe it happened at all. It's a period that's often misunderstood and ignored, but it was the font of a tremendous movement in American politics and touched the lives of everyone in the country. And considering this is a podcast about failure, we can't help but record an episode about Prohibition right before we stop the workday and start drinking for the night.
This is No One is Competent, the premier history show about how movements fail and goals fall short. I'm your host, Jay, and I'm joined, of course, by Azalea. Azalea, how are you doing today?
It's a beautiful day in the content mines, Jay. The canaries are chirping happily, and the shafts go deep and wide. I have done a lot of good work on the book.
Got a lot of child labor going on. Cranking out the pages, mining that content.
I refuse to incriminate myself on the podcast, and I will plead the don't see nothing, don't say nothing. I don't know what you're talking about.
I feel like it's not mining unless there are children involved in some manner or fashion.
They're just, listen, if children didn't want to mine, then they shouldn't be so small and good at getting into tight places.
Yeah, exactly. Same for chimney sweeping and manufacturing shoes, I suppose.
So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the show. Before we get started, make sure you follow us on Twitter at not_competent. You can email us show suggestions and requests at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com, and make sure to like, subscribe, and rate us in whatever podcasting app you are using. We love reviews, especially on Apple. Please just give back a little bit to us. This show is done with no advertisements and no sponsors. We are just putting out this content, so give us back a little bit, tell a friend about it, and rate us, boost us in the algorithms, feed the old gods of the internet, and keep this wagon train a-moving. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce. And Jay, do you have any other banter you would like to do before we jump into this motherfucking episode?
Nope. I think I'm set for my quota of banter for the week.
He's banted, he's chanting, he's going to tell us about the sources.
Indeed. We have quite a few sources for this episode. Just running through them quickly. Those include Spirited Republic by Bruce Bustard for the National Archives, Did Prohibition Really Work by Dr. Jack S. Blocker in the American Journal of Public Health, Going Dry by Michael Lerner in Humanities, The Unintended Consequences of Prohibition, also by Michael Lerner, but for PBS, The Bitter Aftertaste of Prohibition in American History by Roger Catlin for Smithsonian Magazine, The Time When Americans Drank All Day Long by Jane O'Brien for BBC, How Did Prohibition Come About by user Luke in the Skywith in the subreddit Ask Historians, and Gangsters of Capitalism by Jonathan Katz.
So what we're talking about is Prohibition, which is the era of American history when the 18th Amendment was live and enforced. So what was that, Jay? 1920 to 1933 off the top of my head?
Exactly.
Boom.
Yep, that is exactly correct.
Providence on this day. This is going to be an excellente episode. So we're going to talk about those years in American history a lot. But you really cannot understand Prohibition, which again just looks like bizarre today. Like the federal government just telling people you can't drink alcohol. It's unthinkable. It's weird. It's strange. You can't understand why we didn't pass it into law. We passed it into the Constitution. You can't really understand that without understanding the culture and what led up to that. So, Jay, how about you school us on some context?
Well, I suppose that, in terms of context, we got guess we got to go to what we're talking about today, which really is alcohol.
Drugs! I hate how people think alcohol is like different from other drugs. Like, why in the hell do we have a special word for getting high off of alcohol, being drunk, but then everything else is just high? Like, people want to think that their being high is different because it's legal. Bitch, there ain't no difference getting high off alcohol as getting high off of PCP, marijuana, shrooms, whatever's your vice, okay? It's getting high, and humans love doing it. We've been doing it for forever. It's like half the purpose of being alive. It is intrinsic to the human experience. Drugs are great, and alcohol just happens to be the easiest drug generally to do, as God just provides it out in the wild practically.
Yeah, well, that is a good point, because alcohol was never really invented, in any single point in time. A fruit left rotting outside will occasionally ferment without any human intervention, and that's, what leads to the whole genre of YouTube videos that are based around animals getting unintentionally drunk. It's quite certain that our ancestors had similar experiences from time to time. The intentional production of alcohol, on the other hand, has its origins between 10,000 and 7,000 BC in Eurasia. The development of techniques for producing fermented drinks was probably discovered independently by various cultures around the world. All that being said, though, one should be wary of overstating the importance of alcohol to humanity. Popular claims that the creation of alcohol was a main factor in the rise of civilization don't really have any evidence behind them. Additionally, the consumption of alcohol was not a universal experience. Many native cultures from North America have no history of widespread production or consumption prior to the arrival of Europeans. The same applies to the Maori of New Zealand and the Australian Aborigines. Some people will insist that drug use is intrinsic to human nature and a driving force behind human history, but these people are often exaggerating a little bit or letting their own proclivities color how they see the past.
Grumble, grumble,
That
grumble,
being said-
grumble, grumble.
That being said, it's certainly true that alcohol was an important part of most human societies, especially those of the Old World, dating back to prehistory.
For most of human history, fermented drinks such as wine, cider, beer, and mead were the most commonly consumed alcoholic beverages. These basic drinks contained a similar alcohol level to what they do today, but they were often watered down to a more casual drink. Still, mankind wanted a more concentrated high and strove to take alcohol even further beyond. Experiments involving the distillation of fermented beverages in order to produce a higher concentration of alcohol by volume date back to the Middle Ages, with advanced distillation techniques becoming common in China and the Middle East by the 12th century AD, and by the 5th century whiskey was already being produced in Scotland. These liquors often contain alcohol contents double or even quadruple what they were available before, allowing people to get sauced off far easier. While liquors, that is to say distilled beverages, were initially quite expensive, by the 18th century their production and consumption had become commonplace in Europe and various parts of the world settled by Europeans. I love, Jay, how, Europe is colonizing and raping and destroying, the rest of the planet at the exact same time when they are getting more drunk than any other human being has been in history. Directly correlated. George Washington operated his own distillery in his estate in Mount Vernon, and attacks on distilled spirits by the fledgling United States government in the 1790s would lead to an insurrection known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Whiskey, rum, and other spirits were well suited to life in a time before refrigerations and railroads. Farmers turned their surplus crops into liquor, which could then be transported and traded more easily than bushels of grain. These drinks were also less prone to spoiling than beer. The daily consumption of alcohol had been a normal fact of life for many Europeans for centuries. But while in the past this had mostly consisted of fairly weak wine and beer, The rise of hard liquor meant that now people, especially men, were consuming far more alcohol than any prior point in human history. So, Jay, just as the historian on the podcast, often, like, times you'll hear that, like, say people in, like, I don't know, 1159, like, mostly drank beer or wine to, like, avoid the contaminated, like, water, because, you know, people are still, like, shitting in the creek out back.
Yeah.
In this part of history.
It's
how much truth is there to that?
There are elements of truth. It is exaggerated in that people figured out pretty early that, boiling water means that you get less sick, even if they couldn't explain why. The concept was around. So the idea that, you had to go with beer or wine or what have you to avoid contaminations wasn't quite true. Though it certainly did help in environments like on ships where, even if you boiled the water beforehand, you'd be storing it for a long period of time.
Yeah.
So there are elements of truth to that. I think people also can slightly over-exaggerate the effectiveness. Watered down beer can also spoil, and will spoil in the heat. But yeah, it is certainly true that on the balance, it was probably safer than water in a lot of instances.
Yeah, alcohol is poison. It kills things. But one thing we're seeing now in this period is alcohol being used more and more for, its effects of getting high. And it's way easier and faster to do it, because you have a more concentrated drink. You can get faster, way quicker if you can, handle it. And
yeah,
people now have the opportunity, shall we say, while they are bored out on the frontier in the Appalachians and the plains and the reaches of America, to do a lot of drugs.
Yeah. Indeed, by the 1830s, alcohol consumption in America had reached an all-time high when it was estimated that the average adult consumed around 7.1 gallons equivalent of pure alcohol per year. Reminder, that's not 7.1 gallons of alcoholic drinks. That's, if you took the pure alcohol from those drinks and added that all up, it would be 7 gallons. And that was up from around 5.8 gallons in the 1790s. For comparison, the average adult in 2021 consumes about 2.35 gallons of pure alcohol per year.
So, basically like a third. I've heard some estimates that people drank in this period the equivalent of 5 shots of whiskey on average a day, or the equivalent of drinking a whole bottle of wine per day. Those are averages. So there are people who are way over that.
Oh, yeah.
in equivalent alcohol consumption.
Yeah. The English ship captain Frederick Marryat gave a famous summary of the situation. Quote, "The Americans can fix nothing without a drink. If you meet, you drink. If you part, you drink. If you make an acquaintance, you drink. If you close a bargain, you drink. They quarrel in their drink, and they make up with a drink. They drink because it's hot, they drink because it's cold. If successful in elections, they drink and rejoice. If not, they drink and swear. They begin to drink early in the morning, they leave off late at night, they commence it early in life, they may continue it until they soon drop into the grave."
Yeah, this level of alcohol consumption would not be abnormal to us, degenerate podcasters and internet denizens. But if perhaps the average American went back in time to this period, they'd be like, damn, y'all be sauced a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, what were they supposed to do? It was fucking 1830. There was no Dark Souls, okay? The female orgasm hadn't even been invented yet. Like, humans, this is the only way to entertain yourself is to, like, play dice, play chess, hit people, and drink. And you can drink while doing those 3 other activities. Now, given that alcohol consumption tended to be higher amongst men than women, the average adult male was drinking likely higher than 7 gallons. The rise in alcohol consumption coincided with the rise of saloons. While inns, bars, and ordinaries were far from new, Establishments based on the sale and consumption of alcohol and the solicitation that often goes alongside such things proliferated at a rapid pace in the 19th century. By 1897, there were 250,000 saloons in the United States, which is about 23 saloons for every Starbucks in the US today. Saloon culture would develop into its own distinct thing. Saloons would become the primary place of solicitation for American men, and mostly men as they were prominently male spaces, besides the workplace. It's where you go and you hang out with the boys. Saloons were a place for discussing news, sports, politics, just about everything else. Many of these saloons were owned by and catered to the burgeoning immigrant population of America, a fact that we'll return to soon. A town would have an Irish bar, a Polish bar, a German bar, where people could be amongst folks who spoke the same language and had similar beliefs and cultural share points. Of course, the rise in alcohol in the 19th century is not something that went without challenge. That challenge would come from multiple fronts, and the various groups that would spring up and eventually form what would become to be known as the Temperance Movement. And the Temperance Movement is like the subject of this episode, right, Jay? Like, they are the ones that got it's what got Prohibition into law, and when it was kicked out of law, it was their great moment of incompetence.
Yeah, when we were writing this, started off as the Prohibition episode, but I quickly found that, the story of Prohibition and what caused the 18th Amendment to be passed is, in many ways, kind of more interesting to me than the actual decade or so of Prohibition itself.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Like, people did not just suddenly decide in 1920 to ban alcohol. It's over a century of discussions and debates and protests and legislation that led up to this. And it's a massive part of the American story, almost as old as the country itself, that we often do not talk about, which is why we are now talking about it.
Now, the religious opposition to the use of intoxicating beverages had existed for quite some time, obviously. But by the 18th century, such resistance was fairly minimal in the Americas. Secular resistance was also minimal, and alcohol was widely considered, even by medical experts, to be healthy for the body. A general distaste for public drunkenness, often based in class stereotypes, was common, but most people who held that distaste had no issue with drinking alcohol themselves. It's just kind of like the jokes you might have heard about, like the town drunkard or whatever.
Fun fact, or actually no, this is not a fact, this is an anecdote. Don't mess those things up, people. So I did not see this myself, but at a church that I went to for some time, back in like 2006, the high schoolers, about 100 of them, went on choir tour to Eastern Europe. And when they were in, I think Slovenia or Czech Republic, somewhere in Eastern Europe, they were singing in a church in a town, and the local town drunk stumbled in to the church while the concert was going on. And these guys are singing, and they have a view of the door in the back. Most people are facing towards the choir, so they see this guy stumble in, and then they see just two people in the congregation, two big men who know this guy, grab him, pick him up by the shoulders and ankles, and physically toss him out the door onto the street. Because that's how you deal with that guy.
Good. Glad to see traditions being kept alive in Eastern Europe. In 1784, Dr. Benjamin Rush published a paper on alcohol and alcoholism titled An Inquiry into the Effects of Spirituous Liquors Upon the Human Body and Their Influence Upon the Happiness of Society. This paper challenged the notion that alcohol was good for the body. Rush was very well known and respected. He is considered one of the founding fathers, in fact, because he was a signatory on the Declaration of Independence. And like most of his contemporaries, he came from a Protestant background. Among other things, Rush noted the effect alcohol had on the liver and pointed out that the common wisdom that alcohol was good for dealing with cold temperatures was wrong. It's actually more harmful than helpful.
Yeah.
Rush did differentiate between what he called spirits and quote-unquote wholesome drinks, such as beer and wine, but nonetheless, his work is seen as a seminal part of the early temperance movement.
In case you're wondering how the science works there, ethanol makes your capillaries, those are the tiny blood vessels in the top of your body near the skin, it makes them expand. So blood flows from your core to the extremities of your body, and that makes you feel hotter, but it lowers your core temperature, which is not particularly good if you are, say, freezing to death. Now, Rush's work was widely popular and helped to spark a series of temperance movements across the United States. Most of these movements were more religious than political in nature, however, as abstinence from alcohol caught on with groups such as the Quakers and the Methodists. The Methodists, to this day, by the way, will tell you that grape juice was invented so alcoholics could take communion, and Methodists continue to use grape juice in their communion to this day, like I did yesterday at the church that I go to when we did that. Hundreds of local temperance organizations rooted in Protestant faiths sprung up in the following decades. Now, in the early 1800s, this did not stop alcohol consumption from being at all-time heights. And these smaller temperance groups would gain a national voice in the form of the American Temperance Society. The ATS was established in 1826 and advocated initially for voluntary abstinence from the consumption of alcohol for any non-medicinal purposes, and sought to promote this attitude throughout society. The reason we keep mentioning like medicine and doctors and all this is this is a time when, medicine is still like basically equally as likely to make things worse as make things better.
Yeah.
This is in the era of leeches and hacking off limbs with non-sterilized saws that are probably going to get you killed.
Yeah, remember, it was like a controversy when people started pointing out that doctors should wash their hands before doing surgery.
Yep. And most of the cures and medicines that you would find on the shelf of, say, a haberdashery or a pharmacy in the 1800s were probably by weight mostly ethanol.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about how religion is such an important part of this. We often cannot comprehend or understand how much religious motivation drove early Americans. The ATS was deeply connected with the religious thought at the time, and much of its rhetoric was based on the Protestant Christian values. So, this is a time in America when the third, second Great Awakenings are happening, especially in New England, New York, that area. Whole new denominations are getting spun off, and the 1800s are full of really weird communities and utopian societies practicing a very strange form of Christianity that you can look into. People who believed all sorts of things, from a sort of militarism to free love. It's a wild period. And people...
Yeah.
Again, this is a time without TV. People spend all day at religious camp meetings singing songs as their main method of media. They take their religion and what God wants them to do incredibly seriously. Tons of new denominations and beliefs will be spun off in this time. And unfortunately, many of the more successful ones believed that the key to righteous living was to have as little fun as possible. But there was a lot of good in this, okay? The organization, the ATS's first secretary, Joshua Levitt, was a Congressionalist minister, and he was a staunch abolitionist, an example of the overlap between social reform rooted in religious thought. Christian movements played a major role in ending slavery in the British Empire, and while they would be less successful in the US, their efforts are early examples of the sort of social and political activism we are familiar with today. To kind of go back to the theology of it all, sin is defined by Christians as being a separation from God. When you sin, you are less close to God, which, depending on which brand of Christianity you believe in, could range in consequence anything from being just having a worse, less efficient life, or resulting in eternal damnation. So, very serious subject. Yeah. And it's very interesting how these people talk about freedom compared to how we talk about freedom now in America. A lot of Christians in the 19th century argued that banning alcohol was a increase in freedom, because if you weren't around alcohol, if you weren't allowed to drink or be even around alcohol, you didn't have the temptation to drink around you. You couldn't sin. So you were freed from the temptation to sin. And I just find that very interesting, how different people conceptualized freedom and religious values throughout the years. That's not to say that a lot of Christians didn't drink. Most Christians did drink, but this is just these particular weirdos.
Yeah. Now, the ATS was joined in their efforts by other organizations such as the American Temperance Union and the International Organization of Good Templars. The efforts of these temperance organizations led to several regulations being passed on the state and local level, though often with limited actual enforcement. 11 states passed their own prohibition laws in the 1850s, but in all instances save for one, Vermont, the laws were repealed in a few short years. More important is that these groups spearheaded a shifting attitude on alcohol that would actually see the average consumption drop from a high of over 7 gallons per year in the 1830s to a relatively modest 3.5 gallons by 1860. And also, a brief aside, we're talking about the United States in this episode, and that's going to continue, but a lot of this, is also happening in Europe, in Britain, in some of the Scandinavian and Nordic countries, and in Canada as well. In a lot of these countries, you'll have experiments with prohibition on generally a more local level, and it'll usually go about as well as it did in the US.
Yeah, I do believe some Nordic countries had prohibition for a very long time, but I'll have to look into it.
Yeah, Finland had it, I believe, for quite some time.
So that being said, temperance in America did increasingly take on a nationalist tone. Alcohol would come to be associated with immigrants, particularly the Catholics. Remember, all of those denominations and branches of Christianity that were really pro-temperance are Protestant and tend to be very anti-Catholic. Advocating for temperance was seen as protecting American values than those coming from Ireland, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire with their, quote, wet cultures. Quoting from John Greenspan, a curator of political history in the Smithsonian, "It's not entirely polite to say, I want to get all the Catholics out of America, but it's very polite to say, alcohol is ruining society." When we look back at hate crimes and hatred and discrimination in the United States, we tend to focus a lot on anti-black hate and discrimination for the very good reason that there was a lot of it, it was horrific, and it still happens today. But the amount of religious discrimination in America really cannot be overstated. You have mass lynchings of Mormons. You have the rights of all of America being restricted because of the actions of Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, there were a lot of violence and just general segregation and distaste of people along their religious lines in American history, the earliest of which was around Catholics. And these early temperance movements were not entirely united in their approach to desired legal status of alcohol. Now, some simply focused on preaching temperance, others calling for regulations and taxes, but an increasingly large third section of the temperance movement called for an outright prohibition of alcohol, shut it down, none allowed. In 1869, prohibitionists founded the appropriately named Prohibition Party and proceeded to lose just about every election they entered. It was painfully clear that a single-issue third party would not make headway in the American political system. These defeats instead emphasized the need for prohibition advocates to instead work within the party system to achieve their aims.
Now, as of the 1860s, most large temperance movements in the Americas were run by men. Some of them admitted women to their ranks, but the guys were still in charge. This would change in 1874 with the founding of the appropriately named Women's Christian Temperance Union, a women-led organization dedicated to establishing a, quote, sober and pure world. From the 1870s onwards, women would come to dominate the public face of the temperance movement and provide it with most of its energy and zeal for activism. Many of these women would wed the cause of temperance to that of suffrage. Perhaps the most famous temperance advocate of them all was Frances Willard, the national president of the WCTU from 1879 to 1898. Under her watch, the organization would call not just for the prohibition of alcohol, but the right of women to vote, tying the two together under the idea of home protection. Quoting from the Home Protection Manual written by Frances Willard, the object of home protection is to, quote, secure for all women above the age of 21 years the ballot as one means of protection of their homes from the devastation caused by the legalized traffic in strong drink. Essentially that, by voting, women will also be able to bring about prohibition, and then that will further protect them in the home. As it turns out, it would kind of work a little bit opposite, where prohibition, at least nationally, would become before women's suffrage.
But the two were often bound together, with the argument being we need to make it so women can vote, so we can vote prohibition in. And it's weird how, we now see, women getting the vote is the super important building block of American history. But for some people, that was considered like the means to the end of the far more important goal of prohibition. It just goes to show how people saw things differently back in the day. Now, this desire to restrict or outlaw alcohol on the part of female activists such as Willard stemmed naturally from the situation faced by women in the late 19th century America. Western society at the time was highly patriarchal, and it still is, but these days to a far lesser extent, thanks in part by activists such as Willard. At the time, it was seen as accepted logic that a wife should be obedient to her husband, and that the husband had the right to punish his wife as he saw fit, basically as part of his property. While extreme acts of violence were seen as unbecoming, a solid level of domestic abuse was normalized in American society, undoubtedly amplified by the presence of readily available liquor. I won't go into much details because there are people in this podcast people who listen to this podcast who know me in real life and know my family personally. But there are members of my family who have suffered from a rather horrific amount of domestic violence, and that was accelerated and aided by the use of alcohol by a very weak and stupid man who happens to run a lot of my DNA. It's not hard to imagine an American woman in the 1890s who has to take care of her household or work outside the house, as was increasingly common, all day, only to see her husband when he returns in a drunken stupor from the saloons at night. At best, he might just be neglectful. Quite often, he would be abusive. It's not hard to see why this hypothetical woman would support the prohibition of alcohol. There's also a lot of talk about alcohol keeping men from drinking and providing for their wives and children. This is sometimes it's kind of weird because sometimes this is tied into what we might see as like a progressive point of view as, we need like the vote and prohibition so we can free women from these violent men who are terrorizing them. But then there's also like kind of the conservative argument that we need men to be the solid cornerstone of the family and do their husbandly duties of providing for their wife and children instead of acting all drunken and foolish. Because again, American politics are very different back then, and things don't always easily latch on to our modern conceptions. It's easy for people today to call Willard or the WCTU's members misguided for pointing out that alcohol was not the root cause of this problem. Sexism was. We would, however, be saying this with the benefit of hindsight and the safety of being far removed from the historical context. The fact is that women could not easily argue against the elevated position of men in the household or society as a whole. That would be an attack on the power of their husbands. What they could argue for was suffrage and temperance, and the use of those as a springboard for greater equality. We often forget in our country that is currently doing a lot of conservative backsliding that inherent to Western and American conservatism is the idea that men own their wives and can do with them what they want, and women should submit to them. This is often not brought up a lot because conservatism lost so much ground that now they're far more concerned with restricting the rights of trans and gay Americans, for example. But in countries that see conservative backsliding, you often see a rise in domestic violence. Russia famously basically legalized wife beating around 15 years ago, to very horrific results if you want to look into that. And it's just important to remember what when people say return to tradition, what all is entailed in return to tradition. Rant.
The women of the WCTU campaigned extensively for prohibition and temperance. Tactics included calling for state and local bans on the sale of alcohol, holding prayers outside of saloons, and pushing for anti-drinking educational curriculum to be put in place in public and private schools. Alongside temperance and suffrage, the WCTU also called for increased workers' protections, an 8-hour workday, and raising the age of consent. The WTCU would reach a peak of nearly 400,000 members in the 1930s and is still around today.
I am currently looking up their website. I cannot believe that. That's nuts.
One of the most famous and colorful members of the WCTU was a woman by the name of Carrie Nation, who got her start in the organization by founding a local branch in Medicine Lodge, Kansas.
Preserving the past and transforming the future. I am currently on the WCTU website, official website, which, hey, they are celebrating their 150th national convention in August of 2023.
Nice.
You go, girl.
Yeah. Now, in 1881, Kansas had become one of the first states since the 1850s to pass statewide prohibition, but enforcement of the law was very limited and saloons still operated freely. Frustrated with the situation, Nation prayed until she received a vision from God telling her to take direct action against these saloons. Nation and her followers thus proceeded to raid saloons across Kansas, singing prayers while smashing the buildings with hatchets.
Absolute Chad shit.
Yeah. Nation was arrested over 30 times between 1900 and 1910, but managed to pay her various fines by raising money, giving guest speeches and lectures.
Can you imagine like a bunch of ornery little ladies with hatchets like busting in to bars and just like randomly like chopping probably pretty ineffectually at the bar and while they're singing hymns and just like causing an absolute riot. Like I mean I hate these people because they're restricting freedom, and I occasionally like to get wasted, but The absolute moxie. Game has to respect game.
It's an entertaining image to conjure up.
Now, along with the WCTA, the other main group instrumental in the push for prohibition around the turn of the century was an organization known as the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League was founded in 1893 in Ohio, as all evil comes from. By that point in time, 5 states were considered officially dry: Vermont, Kansas, Iowa, North Dakota, and South Dakota. The Anti-Saloon League would take the Prohibition movement to the next level, however, by directly and effectively campaigning for Prohibition to become a part of the highest law of the land by being passed as an amendment to the United States Constitution. The Anti-Saloon League was a powerful organization, and in many ways a forerunner to modern-day political action committees. Quoting from Going Dry by Michael Lerner, "It was a fearsome power in American politics. The League was no modest volunteer organization, with funding from J.D. Rockefeller and contributions from tens of thousands of American churches. The League was structured like a corporation, staffed by lawyers and statisticians, publicists, fundraisers, and researchers. It used modern advertising techniques and printed millions of pieces of literature through its wholly owned subsidiary, the American Issue Publishing Company. Its greatest power, however, was found at the ballot box." Lerner continues by describing the League's actions in their home state of Ohio. Quote, "Unlike its predecessors, the Anti-Saloon League never fielded its own candidates for elected office. Instead, it mobilized thousands of voters to sway elections. In Ohio, the League targeted 70 legislators who were opposed to the dry agenda and managed to drive them all from office before turning its sights on Governor Myron Herrick." The names back then. By the time its campaign helped defeat Herrick in 1905, the League had established itself as a national presence. Party affiliation and drinking habits of individual politicians made no difference to the League. It simply supported candidates who backed the campaign for Prohibition, and it campaigned mercilessly against those who opposed it. So essentially, this is like the 1905 version of the NRA, just for a different issue. Like this terrifying organization who mobilizes voters to go scream at politicians and sway elections on a single issue.
Very much so.
Amazing.
The Anti-Saloon League campaigned extensively in local, state, and federal politics in order to turn as much of the country dry as possible before the constitutional amendment. The strategy would be a success. By 1913, nearly half of the United States was dry, and Wayne B. Wheeler, the head of the League, was viewed as one of the most powerful men in American politics, in spite of holding no elected office. The League can be viewed as either the most cynical or most dedicated of the temperance organizations. While previous movements had promoted other causes, from abolition to suffrage, alongside temperance, the Anti-Saloon League had one goal: national prohibition, and was willing to work with anyone to achieve that aim. The League naturally drew much of their support from the Christian and women movements that formed the basis of the older temperance movement. League pamphlets routinely emphasized the progressive nature of prohibition as well. They highlighted its connections with suffrage and tapped into the trust-busting sentiment of the era by equating the fight against the powerful breweries to the fight against other big businesses. They worked in rhetoric about cleaning up corrupt city governments, as wet politicians were accused of taking money from the breweries and saloons, which many of them were, and they also talked about reducing crime in city centers.
Because drug use, famously, is linked to crime. Yeah, great idea, that one. Yet just as they were playing the progressive card, the Anti-Saloon League also won the support of wealthy industrialists such as John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford, who believed that workers would be more productive if deprived of alcohol. The League also amplified a sentiment that was common in the temperance movement even beforehand: racism. The saloons had long been associated with immigrants, particularly those of Catholic descent. I mean, even to this day, we all know the stereotype of the drunk Irishman. In the South, the League entered into something of an unofficial alliance with the Ku Klux Klan, leading to one newspaper in Alabama noting that in Alabama, it's hard to tell where the Anti-Saloon League ends and the Klan begins. Alabama, by the way, has some of the most dry counties to this day. While the anti-immigrant sentiment had initially focused mostly on Catholics, Germans, Protestant and Catholic alike, increasingly came under fire as well. Given that many of the largest breweries in America were run by German immigrants, famously Schlitz, Busch, Pabst, this made for another avenue of attack for the Anti-Saloon League. And when America entered the war against Germany in 1917, patriotism became increasingly linked with the cause of Prohibition. Quoting from Going Dry, in 1917, one Anti-Saloon League publication crowed, "German brewers in this country have rendered thousands of men inefficient and are thus crippling the Republic in its war on Prussian militarism." Another League pamphlet spoke out against the un-American, pro-German, crime-producing, food-wasting, youth-corrupting, home-wrecking, treasonable liquor traffic. Rising the specter of sabotage and alien infiltration, another publication declared, "We have German enemies in this country too." Reciting the name of the country's prominent brewing companies, it notes the worst of all are Pabst, Schlitz, Baltz, and Miller. Man, I too witnessed plenty of German corruption in my younger years. I'll never forget being a freshman in college and being handed a Coors Light. And when I drink it, it's good. And I drink it, and I'm like, this tastes like evil poison. And then someone hands me, like, I think it was like a Miller High Life or like a Blue Moon. They're like, all right, no, this is better. And I'm like, now I agree with you that this is less bad, but I still want to die when I consume it. I am a mixed drinks kind of guy. Sweeten that shit, girly on the swirly, sugar it up, give me all the screwdrivers in the world, fill me up with watermelon wine coolers and send me home. That's my way, personally. I do not understand beer drinkers.
Now, as the Anti-Saloon League advanced their cause, opposition to Prohibition failed to form a lasting united front. Breweries often did not cooperate with the distilleries, as many expected that a nationwide prohibition would only apply to hard spirits, and thus lead to an increase in the sales of beer. Brewers attempting to defend their image were also hit hard by the anti-German sentiment during World War I. Indeed, some historians claim that World War I was necessary for the passing of the 18th Amendment. Large-scale distilling had been temporarily banned during the war, in fact, in order to conserve grain, which provided a limited proof of concept for prohibition, and racism made it difficult for the breweries to defend themselves. Others disagree about World War I being necessary for prohibition, pointing out the League's many successes prior to the war, but nonetheless, World War I can clearly be seen as having a definite impact. The Prohibition movement was energetic and dedicated, while those opposed to it seemingly underestimated the threat it posed. It is possible that many people just didn't expect that Prohibition would really become a reality. Even as individual states and counties turned dry, alcohol could still be readily had due to the difficulty of enforcing such laws. When all you need to do is drive over to the neighboring county to buy alcohol, these laws aren't really enforced all that much.
Yeah, it's like fireworks today.
Yeah. In any case, the Anti-Saloon League had attempted to unite various groups and sentiments behind the cause of Prohibition, and by 1917 they had succeeded. By the time of the 18th Amendment's proposal, the prohibitionists could count on the support of a vast array of different demographics. Women had been won over by the tying of prohibition to suffrage as a necessary step in the betterment of their gender. Progressives had been appealed to by the talk of busting large businesses and weeding out corruption. industrialists had been wooed by talk of greater worker productivity. In rural areas all across the country, the cause continued to use the same appeals to religious sensibilities that had been central to the temperance movement since its beginnings, and the equation of prohibition to the defense of American values against immigrant intrusion won support all across the board, as America's already typically high levels of racism were amplified even further by the Great War.
So on the day that will live in infamy, December 18th, 1917, the text of the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution was presented by Congress to the states for ratification. The amendment had passed both houses of Congress with significant bipartisan support. Mississippi would be the first state to ratify the new amendment on January 7th of 1918. For those of y'all who aren't aware, like this is a bigger deal than passing a law, because like laws can be repealed by the courts and whatnot. This is changing. This is tacking on to what the founders wanted. This is adding code to the hard drive of America, essentially, and it has to be ratified by the states. So then on January 16th, 1919, the amendment had been certified and became part of the Constitution after being ratified by 36 out of then 48 states. The 18th Amendment specifies that 1. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all the territory subject to its jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. 2. Congress and the several states shall have concurrent power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. I hate fucking reading legalese. Who says thereof? Who the fuck? In other words,
The 18th Amendment.
the amendment does not ban the possession or consumption of alcohol, but instead inhibits manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, a term it does not define. Section 2, which gives Congress the power to enforce the amendment, would lead to the passing of the Volstead Act in October 1919. Now, the Volstead Act, formerly known as the National Prohibition Act, defined any drink with above 0.5 alcohol by content as an intoxicating liquor, and defined fines and regulations for enforcing prohibition. Many individual states also passed their own equivalent laws for carrying out prohibition. Now, for the straight edges amongst you, 0.5 alcohol percent by volume is essentially nothing. Like, your average beer is like 4.5 or 4.8. Your average wine, like, say, 12 to 13. What's generally called liquor, like defined as liquor in most people's minds, is stuff that's 40% or higher. Like that's how the term is used in average parlance. And I imagine there were plenty of people who supported this bill who thought they were just getting rid of whiskey, rum, vodka. But no, everything is declared illegal in this.
Yeah, a lot of people expected beer and wine to be, not covered by prohibition. But obviously that didn't end up being the case.
Yeah, and like, it's hard to imagine if you say, like, oftentimes laws come in conflict with, like, how we behave. Like, if you've never been pulled up over by a cop, you probably are a lot less likely to respect the speed limits, because you can speed all the time and not get pulled over for it, as most people do to a certain degree. Copyright law is famously violated millions of times a minute in America without being enforced, and therefore most people don't know how it works or even that it exists. And if you have a glass or two of wine with dinner every night, and your parents did, you've been doing that for your entire life, it is really hard to imagine the government saying that you can't do that. That would be totally outlandish.
Yeah. Now, the most immediate effect of Prohibition was the decimation of just about every established business involved in the alcohol business. The number of distilleries dropped by 85%. Breweries and wineries were affected similarly. Some businesses survived by producing alcohol for industrial uses or by switching to different products such as non-alcoholic beverages, but most went bankrupt. Restaurants were also hit hard, and the saloons, the scourge of social movements since the 19th century, disappeared almost entirely. Thousands of jobs were lost in the process.
Fun fact, in restaurants to this day, a lot of the margin comes from alcohol sales, that you can mark up a lot higher than you can mark up like the cost of food from like, you know, the grocer that you get it from.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was true back then, and needless to say, restaurants did not do well. Alcohol, of course, did not disappear entirely. Possession of alcohol purchased before the 18th Amendment came into effect was allowed. Because if you remember the text of the amendment, it has a 1-year period. You know, it's 1 year from the ratification of the amendment it comes into effect.
One of the greatest incentives I've ever heard to dig a cellar.
Yeah, you know, this gave those who could afford it a year to stockpile the stuff. Quite famously, Woodrow Wilson had a huge stockpile of alcohol, though probably didn't drink much of it due to health issues.
Yeah, his brain was completely melted at that point. But that's a story. The fact that our country was piloted by a man who was probably even more senile than Trump and Biden, for a while. That's a story for another podcast.
Yeah. Additionally, legal loopholes in the Volstead Act were quickly exploited. Doctors prescribed alcohol for medicinal usage, and new churches and synagogues sprouted up overnight to dispense wine for religious purposes.
Fucking officer, I swear, it's medicinal. But like beyond officer, I swear it's medicinal. It's like, no, officer, I swear, this is for communion.
Yeah. One interesting example of a loophole exploitation was a product called Vine Glow. Vine Glow was a grape concentrate sold by Californian vineyards that could be turned into juice by dissolving it in water. The labels of these bricks of concentrate also contained a handy warning, quote, "After dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away in the cupboard for 20 days, because then it would turn into wine."
Do not do that. Big warning. Everyone who consumes or sees this product, please know to not do that.
Now, the government would clamp down on Vine Glow by 1931, but similar grape concentrates would continue to be popular, you know, even if they didn't put the warning on. By then, pretty much everybody knew what to do. You know, the shipping businesses also made a lot of money simply by taking American passengers out into international waters on old ocean liners, where they could enjoy drinks at will.
Which still happens to this day. Another effect of Prohibition was a steep decline in state revenues. Remember, America generating money off of liquor taxes goes back to 1791. Almost 75% of New York State's revenue had come from liquor taxes prior to Prohibition. Overnight, all of that revenue all but disappeared. Several other states who ratified this thing, you idiots, were affected similarly. Fines imposed on violators of Prohibition were simply not enough to offset the loss in tax revenue, and meanwhile, more money had to be spent on the enforcement of the law. Now, perhaps the most famous consequence of Prohibition was the explosion in crime related to illegal production, transportation, and the sale of alcohol. This is the 20s, after all, in which gangsters are synonymous with the era. America's various gangs recognized the windfall this would bring them before the 18th Amendment came into effect and been preparing for it diligently, building up stockpiles, establishing routes to smuggle alcohol into the U.S., mostly through Canada, and taking over breweries. In Chicago, the syndicates organized a citywide system for brewing and distributing alcohol within a year. Al Capone was making over $100 million per year at the height of Prohibition. Over $1 billion in money today. Prohibition dramatically increases the fortunes of the mob in ways that had never been seen before. Much of this money also went into the hands of politicians and cops in the form of bribes, thus allowing the mob to extend their reach. Prohibition ended up being a law more strictly imposed on the poor than the rich. Now, contrary to popular belief, there's not much evidence for a nationwide uptake in violence during Prohibition. In fact, violent crime likely dropped in many areas. However, the rise of organized violence, dramatized in incidents such as the Valentine's Day Massacre, made for the appearance of a more violent nation under Prohibition, especially now that this violence is being done by organized crime outfits. I want to talk a little bit about that, actually, because it's really weird how when you prohibit a substance, that is some of the best thing you can do for an organized crime outlet, because it allows them to become powerful, and allows them to become powerful by allowing them to become wealthy. Because, making money is hard. The easiest ways to make money are all legal, and are all monopolized by powerful corporations. Sell people oil, sell people clothes. So, if you are an outsider crime force and you want to make money, how do you do it? Well, maybe you threaten people, you extort a protection racket. That's hard. If you have a product you can move, that lets people make money, go into business, have a career working for the mob. Okay? That makes it way more attractive to be a gang leader. And this, you would see this going from the 70s to the 80s in American inner cities. Once you have crack to move, way more gang violence, way more people wanting to be in gangs, because now there is money in gangs. In, say, the 1910s or then later the 1960s of America, it's not very profitable to be in the mob. But now that the mob can sell something, it can create revenue, and it can use that revenue to influence politicians and law enforcement. It's really fascinating how those incentive structures influence crime to me.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, communal drinking culture found a new home in the speakeasy, illicit establishments that sold alcohol to their customers. Speakeasies would go on to be one of the hallmarks of the 1920s, and their fame meant that even those who did not frequent them knew of their existence. Now, sometimes these establishments are we think of them as being totally hidden, but often say a restaurant wouldn't advertise alcohol on the menu, but then you would say a code word from a waiter and they would then bring it out. Or you could be ushered into a back room that you had to pay extra for, something like that.
Indeed. In order to enforce prohibition, the federal government and the states resorted to all kinds of new measures of state power. The federal government established the Bureau of Prohibition, first under the IRS and then as a separate agency. While the Bureau would consistently struggle to combat organized crime due to being understaffed, they did wield power in a way that had not been characteristic of federal agencies for much of U.S. history. Towards the end of Prohibition, the Bureau was merged into the Department of Investigation, and the collective group that formed would be given the new name of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI.
This is literally responsible for the invention of federal cops, of the idea of feds. This is how important this is to American history.
Yeah, feds, federal law enforcement agency sending people, search and seizure in random cities all across the country just wasn't really a big thing. That wasn't a thing in the 18th obviously not the 18th century. It wasn't a thing in the 19th century, really, to any significant extent.
Sorry, I have to go and now make a meme where I have a small domino where guy wants to get more high off of concentrated liquor, leading to the large domino, which is feds murder dozens of children at Waco.
Yeah, like, for the most part, like, before Prohibition, it would just be, like, a lot of times, like, the Treasury agents would, like, hunt down scam artists and con artists and the like. But, like, yeah, the policing state, which we're familiar with, didn't exist. And now the federal and state police would also use new tools to combat Prohibition. Search warrants weren't exactly new. They had been around for ages, but they were rarely issued or used in the years prior to Prohibition. The 18th Amendment brought about a dramatic rise in the use of this tool of law enforcement, effectively normalizing it for the years to come.
Just a PSA, it is illegal for them to search you or your property without a warrant. Often when the cops knock on your house and say they need to search and they don't have a warrant, ask them for it. They'll commonly reply with a line, "Oh, that doesn't matter, I can get a warrant in minutes." They are lying. It takes them a lot longer than that to get that. Do not let them in without a warrant. This has ended another weird anarchist rant from Azalea.
Prohibition also led to a court case known as Olmstead versus the United States, which dealt with the constitutionality of wiretapping. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court held that federal agents could wiretap citizens without court approval in order to gather evidence for cases, a decision that would not be overturned until 1967 in Katz versus the United States. But by then, wiretapping, like the search warrant, had become normalized as a tool of the law.
This is an absolutely nutter butters violation of the Constitution and expansion of federal power to surveil America. Now, welcome to the only part of this podcast outline written by Azalea, because I, of course, have to bring up that Prohibition also saw the rise of the first real instance of militarized policing in America, which was Philadelphia under friend of the show, Smedley Butler. Smedley Butler, of course, being one of the most fascinating Americans to ever live, and if you want to hear me rant and rave about him like the stupid fanboy that I am, please listen to the Business Plot episode of the podcast, which started out as an excuse for me to rant about Smedley Butler, but then turned into an existential crisis over the nature of what we can and cannot know in history. The TLDR is Smedley Butler was a Marine Corps general. By the way, full name Smedley Darlington Butler. That's Brigadier General Smedley Darlington Butler at this point, to you. He ran many of America's overseas colonies in the 1910s. Most notably, he was the military commander for much of the U.S. occupation of Haiti. And in 1924, he took leave from the Corps to become the Philadelphia Chief of Police. Butler had been explicitly recruited and appointed by the mayor to apprehend what they called bandits within the city. And on his first day, he passed these instructions on to his officers, offering a promotion for the first man to get a kill. I'm going to read a direct quote now from Butler. "I do not believe there is a single bandit notch on a policeman's gun in the city. Go out and get some." So, Butler very handily told cops that their main job was to kill people. Not protect and serve, not to be civil servants. To kill people. And they did. Now, these days, it's common for police to use military tactics and equipment, but back then, this was a foreign concept. We're not going to get into the history of policing, but cops looked very different 100 years ago. Many were not provided by the state by weapons. They had to go out and buy their own. Some didn't even wear uniforms. Butler was the first person in America to really put into place the idea of treating cops like soldiers. Okay, he issued them revolvers to carry off duty and made them subject to physical fitness tests. Butler had special police cars constructed where officers could sit backwards in the rear open of the car, so imagine like a Jeep, so they could then shoot out of the back. He created armed motorcycle units and set up a circuit of information booths around Philly, making it into an early surveillance state. And the first few weeks of his rule, Butler ordered massive sweeps of the city to break up undercover saloons. Officers broke into establishments, guns drawn, and arrested anyone there. One of these raids resulted in 1,000 arrests in 48 hours. Another 800. I want you to imagine the constitutional rights broken in order to arrest that many people in so short of time. There is no way you can do that in a way that is helpful to the public or is in any way like in line with the law. Even if you are listening to this and you are a fan of police, which you should not be, and you think state power is good, which you should not, you have to understand that this was mostly just an excuse for cops to do violence so politicians could point at something happening to, quote, solve the crime problem. But if you define crime as violence, this is resulting in a fuck ton more crime. It was also an easy excuse for white cops to abuse black Philadelphians, who accounted for 8% of the city's population, but 25% of its arrests. And we'll let you imagine how many murders of blacks by cops this facilitated. This obviously is a massive problem today, and you can only imagine what 1925 racism allowed for.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with a lot of cops who don't have a lot of training. I mean, police training these days is awful and gets a lot of people killed, but like basically just handing people guns and telling them to go out and arrest people dead or alive. Now, Butler would eventually investigate saloons owned by the same people who put him and the mayor in power, and thus his tenure only lasted a little less than 2 years. Much of Butler's reforms would be walked back, but violence would continue to define the Philadelphia Police Department. Spoiler warning, a future subject of this podcast. And police militarization tactics would be dusted off 2 generations later. Even though they were often rolled back, the Prohibition gave the government, federal and local, new opportunity to surveil, investigate, arrest, and kill civilians. And this trend would only expand in the following decades and be much of the story of the 20th century. Pretty bad, Jay.
Yeah, it is.
And I we didn't have a lot of polls back then. I imagine it was unpopular. How did they end this madness?
Well, in securing the passage of the 18th Amendment, the American Temperance Movement basically ended up being in the position of a dog that caught the car. The Anti-Saloon League immediately began to fall apart, in part due to their connections with the Klan kind of coming more to light, and also due to the personal troubles of their leader, Wayne Wheeler. The travails of the Anti-Saloon League are not what doomed Prohibition, however. The Prohibitionists had won. Now they needed only to sit back and see society transform in the ways that they had promised. Unfortunately for them, that didn't really happen. The popular journalist H.L. Mencken, writing in 1925, summarized the situation as such, quote, 5 years of prohibition have had, at least, this one benign effect. They have completely disposed all the favorite arguments of the prohibitionists. None of the great boons and usufructs that were to follow the passage of the 18th Amendment has come to pass. There is not less drunkenness in the Republic, but more. There is not less crime, but more. There is not less insanity, but more. The cost of government is not smaller, but vastly greater. Respect for the law has not increased, but diminished.
All right. Hold up. I just looked up the word usufructs. Apparently, it's a noun that means the right to enjoy the use and advantages of another's property short of the destruction or the waste of substance. What the fuck, English? What the absolute fuck is this shit?
Yeah. I still don't really know why it's in that sentence, but it is. Mencken's claims don't hold up entirely to research, as we'll get to later, but they reflected the popular sentiment of the era. Now that the prohibitionists found themselves on the back foot, the opponents of the movement would have their day in the sun.
The industrialists who supported prohibition soon came to oppose it, seeing no impact on the productivity of their workforce. Rockefeller publicly reversed his position on prohibition, and the DuPont family supported the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment. Women, seen as the heart of the temperance movement, also increasingly began to oppose prohibition. The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform overtook the Women's Christian Temperance Union in size by 1931. Now, members of the WONPR advocated for an end to strict prohibition, citing the violence that it was causing and the blatant widespread cheating of the law, which would, is believed, set a bad example for American children. In general, the public was turning against prohibition. Even many of those who supported prohibition now came to view the experiment as a failure. The Great Depression only solidified this shift in attitudes. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for president with the repeal of prohibition as part of his platform. Roosevelt won in a landslide. The political power of the prohibitionists had been broken. The 21st Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, reversing the 18th Amendment, was proposed by Congress in February of 1933 and was ratified by the required number of states by December of that year. National prohibition was over. Hallelujah.
A federal prohibition in the United States had lasted from 1920 to 1933. Its effects, however, would stretch beyond that short period of time. The most obvious effect of prohibition was the death of the temperance movement as a political movement on the nationwide scale. While temperance rooted in religion would remain relevant on the local level, with dry counties persisting in parts of the country, mostly in the South, to this day, never again would the movement shape national politics. It is perhaps a bit ironic, then, that the temperance movement did achieve one of their aims, the decline in the average consumption of alcohol, through the 18th Amendment. Even with the speakeasies, bootlegging, moonshine, alcohol, and all of that, alcohol consumption did still drop significantly, falling to under 1 gallon per adult by the time statistics resumed in 1934. Consumption did not return to pre-prohibition levels until the 1970s. Deaths caused by liver cirrhosis also dropped dramatically during Prohibition, and public drunkenness and saloon culture was reduced dramatically and permanently.
Politically, Prohibition had the effect of strengthening the state. Powers old and new had been wielded by law enforcement during Prohibition to a degree not seen beforehand. And while the 21st Amendment brought an end to the Volstead Act, agencies were not wont to give up this newly gained authority. They never will. Income tax also rose in importance during the Prohibition era as money from liquor taxes disappeared. Prohibition left a significant cultural legacy, one that exhibits itself in many ways. The glamorous image of the Roaring Twenties has been in many ways enhanced by the Prohibition. The sin and excess of the decade made all the more striking by their illicit nature. Books, shows, and movies based on the 20s remain popular to this day, and when bars reopened in the 30s, their culture often more closely resembled that of the cosmopolitan unisex speakeasies than the sleepier saloons of the pre-Prohibition era. And of course, one cannot discount the immense influence this had on America through bootlegging. Of course, you've got to make that alcohol, you've got to make it strong and concentrate so you can store more of it in a small amount of space. You then put that alcohol in a box. You put that box in the trunk of a car. You get the maddest lad you know to drive that car across state lines, and you can't get caught by the cops if you can just outrun him. This, of course, leads to many Americans with the incredible skill of driving vehicles at very high speeds, especially in the South. And when Prohibition ended, they had nothing to do but still wished to push on with their fast driving ways. Thus, of course, leading to NASCAR, one of the most important of American institutions.
Yeah, and actually, bootlegging is kind of interesting in that it continued after 1933. One of the most famous bootlegger cars is the 1940 Ford, and bootleggers by then were either operating in the dry counties, or they just were avoiding taxes.
As exemplified by the famous 1980s documentary Smokey and the Bandit.
Yep.
In fact, I looked it up. There's a lot of like dry counties in America to this day, from Atlas and Eureka and Arkansas to the International Space Station. There's plenty of places, especially in the South, where you can only buy liquor at certain stores, and you can, I don't know what it's like up where you live, Jay, but there's a lot of like weird laws down here where like you can't sell liquor on Sundays except for like a very narrow window of time, and I'm sure a lot of those
here it's not
laws.
There are not too many weird ones. I know in Virginia, hard liquors, I believe, either have to be or are usually sold through the ABC, which is owned by the Virginia government. It's like Virginia government-owned stores, which really at this point is more just a way of making revenue for the state than anything else. A pretty smart way of doing that,
Yeah, the South is like really wild with alcohol consumption, like variants, because like you'll have a county in Louisiana where alcohol is just completely flat banned, and then like a few miles away you'll have a county in Texas where you are allowed to operate a drive-up liquor store where a person can hand you a drink that's covered, and by covered I mean it basically has a piece of see-through tape over it. So it's technically not an open container in your car.
Yeah.
God, I love this country. So, Prohibition failed. A lot of things happened. It had a lot of effects on crime, effects on police violence, and there were effects that could be seen by a lot of people, which of course makes an even greater failure that all of the social shit that we just mentioned would happen again 15,000 times worse during the war on drugs, where America would basically repeat all of this nonsense.
Yeah.
From opiates being prescribed for medicinal usages, to police violence, to organized crime spreading and taking over a large, significant amount of the politics and a whole continent of the world. It's really fucking wild how, like, Prohibition is just the sort of, like, trial run for the war on drugs.
Yeah.
And I have, like, no sort of classic Azalea authoritative voice little written up thing to end this podcast. Instead, I kind of wanted to open it up so a new sort of thing we're doing where we're just kind of gonna talk about this subject and a few things we weren't able to like formally put in the notes, but just kind of like discuss. I find Prohibition weird and interesting as like an era in American history. And I think one of the reasons that we ignore Prohibition is because in school in the West, we're taught that history is this straight line of progress building on itself. You know, A leads to B, leads to C. You know, first you invent the light bulb, then you invent a better light bulb, stuff like that. And Prohibition is evidence that it's not at all how history works. You know, people can do things and then undo them and have totally different frames of reference for what the goals of politically affecting society are.
Yeah. Yeah, and like, to me, prohibition is interesting in that, it's a major part of U.S. history as a constitutional amendment. And it's not really understood or taught all that well. In my mind, prohibition ranks up there with a lot of the great activist movements in United States history. There are always these big movements. You think of going from abolition of slavery to suffrage to feminism to civil rights to abortion, gay marriage, and prohibition was one of them, and one of the early ones.
Yeah, the temperance
really,
movement is in that same
abolition.
lineage, and it's just sort of cut out because it failed, and a lot of people these days would see it as stupid.
Yeah, or even as conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, like, people just think of prohibition as like this weird thing that happened in the 1920s for some reason. I don't really look at how it happened. And how, like, it was in many ways a long time coming. And as I mentioned in earlier on in the episode, a lot of this rhetoric, a lot of these movements had overlap with stuff that was happening in Canada, Sweden, Finland, Britain. And you have prohibition in these countries to some degree or another, usually on a more local level, sometimes more just based on regulation.
Yeah, it's kind of part of that progressive idea about improving society. And
very much
also,
so.
like, the big government idea of we're going to tell you what you can and what you can't put in your body. This echoing all the way, to like Bill de Blasio trying to outline certain sizes of, no, not de Blasio. Who's the fuck? Bloomberg. I swear, Michael Bloomberg is such an incompetent politician that he's even like hard to remember his stupid fucking face. He didn't like try to ban like sodas of a certain size in New York City.
Yeah,
which everyone hated him for.
I say a lot of the complexity about prohibition is also kind of forgotten because, while I think it was a bad amendment, I am glad that it was repealed, the only amendment to be repealed, essentially.
The one time.
You can point to alcoholism being a major problem in the United States, and you can point to prohibition having some positive impact on that problem. Mm-hmm. Like I said, deaths due to liver cirrhosis did factually reduce during the period of prohibition. And some of you might remember, if you read Cracked a long time ago, that there was an article in Cracked about how prohibition was a success. And this was mostly based on an older New York Times article from, I believe, the 80s or 90s. And like, that was sort of like, that New York Times article was one of like the first things to really push back against the notion that prohibition was a 100% failure at every single thing it attempted. I think that historiography now is a little bit outdated. I don't really agree. Would not say that prohibition was a success. But it is also interesting how you have these positives and negatives of prohibition, and you have to decide as a society, what do you value more? And I think as a society, obviously, we did decide that we would deal with the negatives and move on, and that's what happened. But understanding the mindset of the people who wanted prohibition before and even during its existence, I think, is important to understanding the history of prohibition.
For the Zoomers in our audience, Cracked.com was this glorious website in the aughts and early teens that featured articles that were like fun to read and funny and weird, and they were often about like teaching you weird shit in pop history and pop science that isn't covered in school, often half of which was just completely wrong and from totally awful sources and would be like passed off as incorrect folk internet wisdom for years, and some of which expose some of the stupidest, craziest things we do not talk about in history. 2011 was great. You could just go on to crack.com and just completely roll the dice on like something that is either like incredible knowledge that reframes the way you think about America and society, or shit that's basically just like complete conspiracy theory, ancient aliens nonsense. It was glorious.
Very much so.
I think about how Prohibition was like. I think about how Prohibition was a part of the movements of his time. Like, you know, in the early part of this podcast, I wanted to insert a lot about religion, as I'm a religious person, and I think about religion a lot. And Prohibition is sort of part, and Temperance before it is kind of part of this, like, weird health craze part of American history that spans from, like, say, the 1880s to, like, the early 1900s. Like, this is when gymnasiums were, like, a thing. The idea that you would pay a fee to go to a place and exert your muscles was a thing that humans had to, like, really invent. And did invent in this time. The idea that you should strive for healthy living, and that people would tell you how to do that. You know, Temperance happens around the same time the first hit fitness magazines are happening in America. Temperance is a part of the same, like, religious tradition about fun being bad that led to our country bringing back circumcision as a common thing to do to infants because we thought that would stop them from masturbating. Okay, it's the same reason that Kellogg invented like cornflakes, because bland foods with high starch were supposed to be part of a more enlightened way to live. Okay, people went to the first health clinics, insane asylums were renovated and made more popular around this time. It's kind of weird how this would be sort of a precursor to, like, the health nut craze of the aughts with all, you know, organic, non-GMO, anti-MSG, anti-gluten shit we have these days. Obviously, you know, it's a lot lamer. It was a lot more kind of hardcore back then. But that was a movement in America that temperance was kind of the main, like, political thrust of.
Yeah.
Do you want to wrap up by talking about some of how this subject is poorly taught and understood, maybe some common misconceptions around Prohibition?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, common misconception, violence definitely went super way up during Prohibition because of gangs. And like I mentioned earlier, there's not really much evidence for that. You probably had violence go up in some places and down in other places. Remained pretty even. Organized crime certainly increased, and I think that's the major difference. And organized crime is a lot more dramatic. You know, we don't remember a random drunk person killing another person in the bar fight or whatever, but we do remember the Valentine's Day massacre.
Yeah, the vast majority of gun violence is just one person. Well, okay, the vast majority of gun violence is suicide, but most is just one person shooting another with a handgun. But when we think about gun violence, we think about the spree killings with a rifle.
I think another thing is the importance and the nature of the anti-saloon league, because, you know, a lot of us, when you hear about, you know, the Prohibition and temperance movements that led up to it, we hear a lot about the women's movements, and those are very important. But, like, the highly cynical and, you know, very modern anti-saloon league, which, you know, is making alliances with all sorts of different groups, appealing to progressives while they're wooing industrialists, and acting as as a modern political action committee does, is something that, like, very few people know about. And that also goes away to explaining how Prohibition came about. It's just how you can have, like, these very influential political movements with enough funding and enough backing.
I think when we teach history, we talk a lot about, like, the evolution of technology, physical technology that we use to, like, you know, make a phone call or something. But we often don't talk about, like, the evolution of political and ideological technology and religious of thought, like religious thought, the way religious people think about things, conceptualize things, political thought, the way people decide what actions are supposed to be politicized in society. These days, abortion access or voting rights might be crux voting issues, but you go back 100 years and people are arguing about whether or not we should drink alcohol and have paper money.
Yeah.
And organizing and getting people together, sending letters to your congressman, lobbying the government, putting pressure on politicians. This was ideas that had to be invented and iterated on. And the temperance movement is a huge part of the political technology of America advancing.
Very much so.
Anything else?
Oh. No, I think that about covers it.
That's going to do it. This is very similar to our Reconstruction episode, but I still think this is kind of like a new sort of thing here at No One Is Competent. A fun covering of an era of failure that ended in a blaze of glory and then had nothing learned from it. Once again, we urge you please to rate and review us on whatever podcasting app you are listening to us on. You can please, one thing you can do, just tell friends about the podcast. Tell a buddy. Everybody tells a buddy, and then we'll go from, having 12 listeners to having 24 listeners. You can help us out a lot. Remember, our music is by the legendary Sam Bryce. I had a really funny joke that I was going to say now, but I have forgotten it, and I'm going to remember it 5 minutes after we start recording, and I am going to be completely furious with myself. Regardless, my feelings don't matter. Y'all are here to be entertained, and we are now done entertaining y'all. So, signing off and be good.